Today, I'll be, of course, discussing about ancient Mesopotamia. It's like the background of it. I'll kind of first talk about, and then I'll get in mostly to talk about some of the early civilizations that were part of Mesopotamia originally, like the Sumerian one is one of the ones we'll talk about the most today. That'll take up a lot of time. And I will kind of briefly talk about the Akkadians, who were kind of around at the same time, and we'll kind of be getting closer to like the Babylonian culture, which will come. I don't know if we'll have time to get into the Babylonians. They also come in as well, and are part of the culture of that period overall. Like I said, of course, we're going to move on to talk about ancient Mesopotamia. Of course, you saw that little short video. It kind of showed you, of course, on the background of ancient Mesopotamia. So you can see it goes back as a civilization a long time ago. I think I mentioned here how there were 4 river valley civilizations that we had kind of talked about before, kind of blow up here, you can see. So I think we had talked about Mesopotamia being the oldest, which went back over 10,000 years ago. We also talked about India being the second oldest, based around South Asia, Indus River mostly. Also the Ganges River as well in South Asia. China, third oldest, based around the Yellow River in East Asia. And then Egypt, based in North Africa, of course, around the Nile River Valley. So those are kind of like some of the things we talked about at the end of the last lecture, I know, when we're getting into talking about prehistory in general. But I'm going to get, like I said, mostly talking today about ancient Mesopotamia as a culture in general. Mesopotamia, like I said, is the 4th oldest. I think I told you about the 2 rivers that it was based around, which the Tigris River, and of course you have the Euphrates River that we discussed before. And of course, I didn't get into the name, about, what they actually called it. If you know about the name Mesopotamia, the name Mesopotamia was supposedly, they think, coined by the Greeks, like a long time ago. I think there was a Arian of Nicomedia, who was a Greek writer writing about, I want to say 1900 years ago or so, maybe around the time of Emperor Hadrian. He wrote a series of books that were called the Anabasis of Alexander, which discussed the campaigns or conquests of Alexander the Great, who conquered most of the Near East, including where Iraq is, Mesopotamia today. They think he was kind of one of the first to kind of divide Mesopotamia off from as a separate area or region of that part of the world. And so they think from Greek that the name Mesopotamia means or translates as meaning usually land between the rivers. Some people will say 2 rivers because they're talking about the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So it's kind of like that middle land that they're talking about that was very fertile back then, where they grew a lot of crops in general. And so they think that's where a lot of your earliest civilization began throughout the world, and then I guess spread elsewhere as well. A lot of historians see Mesopotamia as the birthplace of civilizations, like in the southwestern part of Asia. It's the location of where Mesopotamia is. Later, I think by the time of the British, like the British Empire, which kind of come to dominate that area, I know by the 19th century, they are the ones that kind of started calling it Cradle of Civilization. And so the name kind of stuck afterwards. And so that's often a term that they often use to describe, Mesopotamia in general. But the modern name of Iraq doesn't really come around until later, which I'll kind of explain a little later why they call it that. I have a map showing you on area. Of course, you can see here in this map here, you can see the area what we call Mesopotamia or Iraq is kind of in an area that's between, you've got Iran over here, plateau of Iran, the Zagros Mountains, and then you've got the Syrian desert over here to the west. So it's kind of like in that area between there. You got like Jordan and Syria to the west. Turkey to the north, and part of Syria. It's up here too as well. And then you've got to the south, the Persian Gulf. So you kind of see those areas we're talking about where most of that area of Mesopotamia is, right there in that red area. Now, there's another term which is real popular, especially by the 20th century, you may have heard about, which is the term Fertile Crescent. That became a very popular term that was coined by this man named James Henry Breasted, who was a archaeologist at the University of Chicago. He actually made the first map of that part of the world, and he called it the Fertile Crescent. And he, by the way, called it that because he was describing the fertile valleys of like several rivers, like 4 of them. Euphrates River, Tigris River, Jordan River, and he also included the Nile River, because I think the actual arc of the Fertile Crescent went from like Egypt and North Africa into Israel, into Syria, and then coming down into Iraq, of course, today. And so that was a term that became popular, I think, by the 1920s and 30s, and they still use it today. But it's more of a modern nickname that they started using later, more or less. Also, in that area where you see Mesopotamia, if I go back to this map, which is right here, the other name I just mentioned about the name Iraq is more of a modern name, which it comes from different terms. I know the Persians started using the nickname. I think that the Israelites or Jews started using it. I think they spell it as E-R-E-C-H, Eric or something, or Iraq. I think is how they say it, I guess. Although I think the Sumerians had different names for it. I think the original name for Mesopotamia or Iraq was Unug, U-N-U-G, was the Sumerian dialect in Cuneiform. But Iraq is the famous city that was a well-known city of the Sumerians, considered the greatest city they built, I guess, city-state. And it's supposedly the city where the king of Iraq, Gilgamesh, reigned from. And of course, later on, the Sumerians wrote epics about him, so-called Epic of Gilgamesh, which is, of course, well-known. So that's the origin of where the modern name of Iraq came from, which was a variation of that Sumerian city's name. Another thing about Mesopotamia, which is true about it, Mesopotamia is well known for being an area in the book of Genesis in the Bible. You've got all these different biblical stories that appear that are very famous, like the Garden of Eden, like the idea of like the whole myth that Adam and Eve, or I guess the creation myth, we would call it now, is something that's mentioned a lot by a lot of different civilizations. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians mention about a creation myth idea. I think Sumerians even have their own name for it, which is Dilmun. So that's one story that appears a lot, of course, in Mesopotamia. Story of Noah in Noah's Ark and the flood story. Hear about that a lot. It's very comparable later to the Epic of Gilgamesh as well, which has a kind of a parallel story about having to build an ark when there was a great flood to save humanity. Tower of Babel, that's another story, which of course mentioned in the Bible as well. And Tower of Babel might be kind of where later on a lot of the cultures in Mesopotamia get the idea to build these kind of like step pyramid structures, which they later call ziggurats. And so they think that might be an influence also as well. And of course, the Tower of Babel was supposedly built after the flood, when humanity built this huge tower to heaven. They're trying to build it, and it was never completed. Story of Abraham is another story. Of course, they mentioned also later in the book of Genesis. They think Abraham may have actually come from the southern part of Mesopotamia, supposedly born in the city of Ur, they think. So, and they later, of course, moved into Canaan, where Israel, of course, would be later. So all these kind of stories, appear at one point in the Bible and have kind of an influence later. Now, another thing about that map, if you go back to it, Mesopotamia is also kind of located. It's kind of a crossroads of that region, especially like with the trade routes and so on. A lot of trade routes running in and out from different continents there into Africa. But it's like near like three continents. So it's in southwestern Asia, but you can see it's like close to Africa and close to Europe. So that's often caused a lot of different people to kind of converge on that area at one point. A lot of trade routes running in and out. You got these caravan routes running east to west or west to east throughout that region. So that affects a lot of things, trade today. It's also caused a lot of warfare from ancient times up to medieval to modern times as well. And now the big conflict over there is, oil. Oil's become, the big thing in the Middle East, as you know. And of course, they've got a lot of it, like Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and so on. So that's given them a lot of power, as countries in that Middle East, part of OPEC, general today in modern times. Now, if you look at Mesopotamia itself, there's different peoples that populate it over time. They usually break them down into two groups. You've got those that are Semitic peoples that kind of populate originally the areas of like the southwestern part of Asia, from like Syria, Jordan, those areas going all the way down into the Arabian Peninsula originally. And you also got Indo-Aryan or Indo-European peoples that are kind of outside of that area. They're not from like southwestern Asia, but either from parts of Europe or Asia. And so those kind of groups are kind of at one point converge on that area. I'll get to the Sumerians. They're not really either one of those. They're not sure what their background is. But the majority of the people that, take over Mesopotamia and rule it are mostly one of the two. Early on, it's mostly Semitic like states that are there. But later on, they're not. I think the last one was the one of the Chaldean Empire of Nebuchadnezzar, and then after that, they were all controlled by Indo-Aryan or Indo-European type peoples later. These are examples of different types of peoples that populated that region of southwestern Asia at one point. Obviously, Arabs and Jews or Israelite peoples, I guess Hebrews originally, some of the original ones that are kind of in that southwestern part of Asia, Israel, and then the Arabian Peninsula down there. Phoenicians, more like above Israel originally. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, mostly around Iraq, or mostly in those areas. A lot of them are made up of what they call Afro-Asiatic peoples, either living in southwestern Asia or some living in North Africa. But the ones in North Africa are more like the Egyptians, the Berber, Cushites, you may have heard of. I guess later the Carthaginians, maybe, if you want to throw them in also as well. But those are peoples that are more in North Africa. But they used to say that they were all related to Shem and Ham. They were related back to Noah. I think the old term about these kinds of cultures was that they were called Hamitic Semitic, or Hamito-Semitic, I think was the actual term. But they got rid of that term. They don't really use it anymore. And so the term Afro-Asiatic is now used today. Indo-Aryan or Indo-European peoples, these would later be groups that would populate and take over parts of that region around Mesopotamia. You've got those that are Iranian or Persian peoples that come out of Iran, but they're actually called Aryan peoples. They came out of up there above, like where the Caspian and Black Sea are, like above Iran. So they would populate those areas, and of course the Persians would later help develop the Persian Empire, which would conquer that part of the Near East and create one of the largest empires in the world by about the 6th century BC. Hittites were in Turkey, although they think they came out of Eastern Europe originally. They're kind of considered like an Indo-European people, but they are kind of influential in the region. And at one point, the Hittites actually sacked Babylon, close to about 1600 BC. The Greeks, the Romans, you see later the Turks and other groups that'll come in later. Those are all kind of considered like Indo-Aryan peoples, really Indo-European peoples, I guess, that kind of populate that area. The Turks are probably more Indo-Aryan because they come out of Asia, but the Greeks and Romans come more out of Europe and take control of that area at one point, because Roman Empire actually got as far east as close to the Tigris River and the Caspian Sea. So it was a pretty extensive empire at that time. But those are all different groups that, of course, populate that region. But I'm going to first get in and talk about the Sumerian culture that first comes in, which the Sumerians are a type of culture that, like I said, was one of the oldest. They usually call the early part of Mesopotamian culture, it's usually nicknamed either early Sumerian or also called early Mesopotamian culture, because it includes Sumerian culture, the Akkadians, and then they easily throw in the Babylonian culture that was also in Mesopotamia as well. So they date back the furthest in Iraq as a major civilization. They don't know the origins of the Sumerians. So they seem to think that the Sumerians migrated into Iraq sometime between 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. So it's kind of a debate about where they were from. Maybe they came out of Asia. They're not sure today. It's still kind of a mystery of where the origins of where the Sumerians came from. But what we do know about the Sumerians is that they eventually settled in what is the southern part of Iraq. Like the southeastern part of it is mostly where they would establish their culture. I do have a map showing you the area of where they mostly would settle, and I guess where the so-called heartland of Mesopotamia would end up. You can see in kind of that orange area that's in the southeastern part, kind of right above Kuwait. Today would be about where the Sumerians settled as a people. And the name Sumer, by the way, is a Akkadian nickname. The Akkadians, who kind of like were right above them as a culture, called it that. And they called it Sumer, which I believe the name Sumer meant, if you want the translation of it, it meant the land of the civilized kings. So that was the translation of what the name meant. The Sumerians had a name for their people, which were called, they thought their name of the Sumerians, when their I guess in cuneiform, was the black-headed people, is what their name actually meant, which that could mean anything. It could mean they had black hair. It could mean they had a black complexion. I know people say African, maybe, but they could have also been from like parts of the East, like India, where you've got a lot of dark people as well. So they don't really know the origin of who these people really were. But basically, what they do know is that the origins of the Sumerians, like I said, they don't know what their background is. So they're not considered Semitic. They're not considered like Indo-Aryan or Indo-European. It's kind of like this Semitic, or I don't know, pre-language before, I guess before any other language. They didn't have any language before that. So I guess they don't really know what their language really is. So it's kind of a debate today, throughout the world about what exactly, their origin, their language really was. But the book of Genesis, which is in 10:10 on Genesis in the Old Testament, says that one of the old names that they used to call Mesopotamia was Shinar, which Shinar would include, I think, the area where Babylonia was, like Babylon was, like a long time ago. So that's what the Hebrews or Jews later, nickname it more or less. But Sumerian, like I said, is more of a name that the Akkadians kind of invented, who was another culture there that was Semitic, that was kind of right after them. Like I said, that the Sumerians had like these agricultural city-states that they founded throughout that region you're looking at. If you go back to the map that I just showed you right here, there was like a bunch of, I think it was like 20, 30 of them that they built at one point. They were all kind of independent of each other, and they had separate states where they had ruling dynasties that reigned over them. I've got examples of different types of city-states that were well known. Ur is considered, I think, one of the most famous because that particular city-state is mentioned in the Bible. If you know about that's where Abraham supposedly came from. Eridu is supposedly one of the most oldest of the ancient cities of the Sumerians. Some historians think it dates back to 3000 BC. In fact, Arabs, I think, or Iraqis, I know today in Iraq today, claim that it's one of the oldest towns in the world that there ever was. Eridu, that one right there. Iraq, they say, was the largest and the greatest city-state of the Sumerians. It may have had a population close to 80,000. I think the average population of most of the city-states averaged about 30 to maybe 80,000 range. Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, Larsa, those are just examples of other different, city-states that were well known. Maybe Babylon may have also could have started out as one, maybe, or some kind of city-state was there before. I think that became something else later. But those are all examples of different ones that they, of course, were known for. Which I think there's like 20, more, I want to say maybe 24, maybe at the, it was like 25 is actually, I think, the range of how many they actually had, city-states wise. Now I'll get to it later. A lot of these city-states, not just having separate dynasties of rulers, they also had like their own like gods and different cultures that were kind of maybe unique to each other. Usually each city-state had a chief deity that they worshipped, which I'll kind of talk about later. They grew different kinds of crops in Mesopotamia. Mostly they grew grain crops. You can see, of course, in that list there. Barley, wheat, millet. Those are the main kinds of crops predominantly grown throughout there and other parts of the world. Millet's grown in Africa, parts of Asia. Sesame, you can see there. The date palm. When the Bible talks about honey, they're talking about sugar from like date palm, not from honeybees usually. Different kinds of vegetables, fruits, some fruits. They raise different kinds of cattle. They mostly, pastoralism, raising like sheep and goats and other kinds of similar kinds of cattle throughout that part of the world. So they're one of the first cultures to use irrigation, to use the waters of the Tigris Euphrates, to water their crops, etc. Now, I want to get into and also talk about technology because that's, I guess, one thing that the Sumerians are really famous for, which is, of course, cuneiform, which you may have heard about. And cuneiform was a type of writing or language system that was invented by the Sumerians. They think probably about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And it was a type of language system, by the way, that was used quite a lot throughout the Bronze Age and even down into the Iron Age by some of the cultures. I want to say all the way down to the time of King Hammurabi. It was a type of logo-syllabic script language that used like symbols, like pictograms or ideograms, and the symbols meant like ideas or maybe an object or something like that. And they, over time, they developed these into a primary system of language that became also obviously like a kind of like an alphabet over time. You can see those are all the different cultures that used it at one point. Akkadians used it later. The Babylonians had their own version. Syrians, Chaldeans, even the old Persians from part of Iran used it at one point, believe it or not. But it was replaced by other languages that were a lot easier over time because cuneiform was very difficult. It had a lot of symbols, depending on the time frame when it, I guess, what version we're talking about here. I think anywhere from 600 to maybe 1,200 symbols may have been used at one point. That image, you can kind of see how they kind of would develop it. So I think some theories, they may have, taken something like an object or a bird or something like that, and that became a symbol that meant something over time, or it could be like an idea, like an ideogram being used also as well. But over time, it kind of becomes like a consonant type alphabet that they use in a language system. If you know about cuneiform, they mostly wrote on clay tablets, like wet clay tablets, also on stone as well, but more on clay tablets, of course, using some kind of stylus. And as you know, what happened was in modern times, close to like I want to say the 18th century, it was the British that later coined it. There was a man named Thomas Hyde, about 1700, coined the name cuneiform, which meant in Latin wedge shape, because of the fact the symbols have this wedge shape to it that it has. And so the name stuck later. And so the people start using that name, but they don't really know, what the original name they called it, more or less. In a sense, it's almost like some kind of primitive iPad. You know how with an iPad you'll use a stylus or something like that. So it's kind of like that. Now they would indent into it, and then I guess they would put it outside. In Iraq, some of the temperatures get up to like 120, 130 degrees, Fahrenheit, and so they just make them like almost like rock after that. So, but some are carved in stone also as well, and not just clay tablets overall. They found a lot of these, by the way, throughout the area around modern Iraq. There's been I think as many as 2 million tablets have actually been discovered throughout the region, but only about 100,000 have actually been translated. So I would say maybe 5 to 10% they've actually tried to translate them more than anything. The British Museum in London, by the way, has the largest collection of cuneiform tablets in the world, 130,000. Or something around that amount, which is pretty amazing. I think Iraq wants to get a lot of those back, but they took those probably back in the 19th century or whatever, or 20th century probably too as well. Now there's one famous story you probably have heard about, which of course is well known in of course Iraq, which is basically the Epic of Gilgamesh, which the Epic of Gilgamesh is considered, by the way, to be one of the oldest recorded stories in the world, which went back to Sumerian Akkadian times. And it's an epic poem about this famous king of the city-state of Iraq, of course, named King Gilgamesh. I think he's also called Bilgamesh with a B also as well. And it's an epic, by the way, that was originally found complete in 12 tablets in the 19th century, in the 1850s. They actually found a complete copy of it in the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, who was a Assyrian Empire famous king. And Nineveh was like one of its capital, the Assyrian Empire, and it was destroyed later. And so I think some of the archaeological digs there, they were able to find the actual 12 tablets to it. So it's a very famous story of King Gilgamesh, which tells like of his adventures. And there's one part of the adventure where he seeks eternal life, where he tries to find this plant. If he eats it, he'll basically live forever. But I think what ends up happening in the story is that some kind of snake steals it from him. It's kind of similar to the creation myth, I think, part of the story. But the story also has some parallels to it, which are famous with the Bible, if you know about this, which is the story of Noah, in the Great Flood, which appears in, the book of Genesis. So there's a lot of parallels with that story, which is well known. I think it's in Tablet 11. There's a lot of similarities between the story of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah. I do have kind of show you a comparison of the two different stories, kind of side by side. But you see with Gilgamesh, the gods got angry and decided to destroy humanity. And there was like this man named Ut-Napishtim, who was like kind of like the Sumerian Noah, I guess. built a large boat to save humanity and, I guess, animals, etc. Of course, in Genesis, God got angry. So instead of multiple gods, it's one God, I guess. So God got angry. And so Noah and his family built the ark, as you can see there. Then you see on the left side, Gilgamesh, his boat landed on Mount Nisr. And then, of course, Noah's ark lands on Mount Ararat. See right there. See on the left, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, swallow, and a raven after the flood ended. And Noah sends out a raven and a dove after the flood. It's interesting how they're kind of similar to each other. Gilgamesh has a chance to gain immortality by eating the plant, but he fails to get it because of a serpent. And you see Adam has a chance to gain immortality by eating from the tree of life, but fails because of the serpent also as well. So they're kind of similar, the way the two stories are. So that's common, must have been common, information back there, and there may have been a flood. I think in different parts of the world, there's talk of floods happening, a long time ago like this, which could have been influenced, by the climate change, also from, when the glacial period ended. That could have what actually caused it rather than, I just don't know if it could rain that much to cause that, but, that's something that you can also think about as well. Other things, too, that the Sumerians were kind of known for, which I did want to talk about today as well. I'll get to talking about Leonard Woolley later, a little bit about him as well. But the Sumerians had a lot of different types of technology that they were well known for inventing or influencing later on other people. I've got a list of them. There's like just some of them that they kind of invented that was well known. They do think the Sumerians were one of the first to mass produce bronze, like tools and weapons. They figured out, that they could take copper and tin and mix it together, smelt together. The wheel, they pretty much utilized that to develop the cart. But I think they think the Sumerians were one of the first to develop the horse-drawn war chariot used in warfare later. Sailboat, glass, they think, went back to that time, use of glass. I think they started making glass. Plow, as in the bronze plow as well. Iron plow, though, is not developed till the Chinese, believe it or not, in Asia. They developed the first cities, like the city of Eridu I told you about. They do think the Sumerians developed beer, like forms of alcohol. They figured out that they could take grain like barley and ferment it and make it into alcohol. And Sumerian beer is different from later beer. I think later beer is more bitter, using hops, etc. But theirs is more like a malt liquor beer. They knew about time, like they knew about the minute, 60 seconds in a minute. They knew about the hour. They knew about the calendar system of 360 days or whatever, how many days it was back then. At least 360 days, they knew about that. They had forms of math, which I think they knew, like forms of 60 we talked about but in that video, but they had no comprehension about zero or the fact that you could have nothing. They didn't understand that. They one of the first to develop mass irrigation to grow crops, astronomy, engineering, those kind of things. They had organized religion, and then, of course, law codes. They did have some early law codes, which there was a king named ur-nammu, who was a king later around the 21st century. He developed some of the earliest law codes that later influenced, like the Bible, and probably influenced the Hammurabi Code as well. Sumerians were also, I'll get to it later, but they were polytheistic. They worshiped, dozens and dozens of gods, which a lot of these gods were based off of nature. They could be anything from dealing with the earth, the sky, rain, storms, the moon, the sun, like we have today naturally. A lot of their cities were built around these massive temple complexes that were called a ziggurat, which you can kind of see. That's kind of one behind me, which Hangars of Babylon is kind of like a ziggurat, somewhat like a ziggurat. But they had these huge temple towers that they would build, like the Tower of Babel, which, of course, is well known today. which is mentioned, like I said, heavily in the Bible. And these are types of mud brick structures that were kind of built similar to like a step pyramid, or they were built in kind of a cylinder type structure, which might even have a spiral staircase kind of going around it, which it could be either one. And I've got a picture showing you of the Tower of Babel, which in some European paintings, later on in modern times, I think it is, they have it more of a cylinder shape with maybe spiral staircases kind of going around it at one point, which you see there. And of course, this goes back to the Bible. Of course, in the Bible, like I told you before, sometime after the flood, they think that humanity tried to build this huge tower to God in heaven. And so God got angry and made all the workers speak multiple languages, so they couldn't finish it. And so the word Babel supposedly meant confusion. So Tower of Confusion. It's also the origin where the term Babylon came from, or Babylonian. And they think that the Tower of Babel was built by this man named Nimrod, who you may have heard of, who was in the Bible. He was descendant from Noah. He was, I think, a great-grandson of Noah. And anyway, they think later it was rebuilt by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar, which may have led to this famous ziggurat built called Intiminanki, which doesn't exist anymore. And they think that may have been the tallest ziggurat ever built, which was at least 90 meters tall, like more than 200 feet tall at one point. But I think it collapsed later, if you know about that. So yeah, that's one of them that's very famous. The Tower of Babel, by the way, appears in Genesis 11, 1-9 is where it is. I don't know if you ever read this. Where's that story about the have you ever heard this one called the Book of Jubilees? It's kind of like Apocrypha. That was part of the Old Testament, but they claim that the Tower of Babel was 5,433 cubits, which cubits is in the Bible, is a form of Egyptian measurement, which is like it's like your from your hand to your elbow, about in length. And I think that was equivalent to like, what was it? 8,000 feet tall. So which is like a skyscraper or something like that, the Tower of Babel, but they don't think it was probably that tall, but that's just what some people thought in ancient times. But yeah, that the one of Nebuchadnezzar, it may have been over 200 feet tall. That may have been built, but like I said, it later collapsed at one point. There's one, of course, I'll show you, which has been rebuilt. That's very famous today. Here's, by the way, a shape of what a lot of ziggurats usually look like. They're kind of, like I said, more of they almost look like I don't know if you ever seen the Pyramid of Zoser, which is one of the first pyramids built in Egypt, or maybe some of the Mesoamerican pyramids that were built in the Americas, but a lot of them were built kind of like this step pyramid shape, like a staircase kind of going up. So that's how a lot of them, they think, originally looked a long time ago. They over time, they kind of changed in design, more or less. But the one that's been rebuilt today that's very famous is the Ziggurat of Ur, or some people call it the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which was built in southern Iraq. I think it's near Nasiriyah is the location of where it is today. This one was a famous ziggurat that was built by a king named King Ur-nammu, who I mentioned before, who lived in the 21st century BC. And he built this ziggurat to honor their moon god, which their moon god was named Sin, which I think the Akkadians later call that god Nanar, either one. And I told you that Ur-nammu was famous for creating one of the first written law codes, which was later called the Code of Ur-nammu, which I think had something like, I forget how many laws it had in it, but I think it had like 20, 30 laws in it, not that many compared to, say, the Hammurabi Code later, but they think it kind of influenced the Hammurabi Code. But here's the dimensions of it. The Ziggurat of Ur is about almost 100 feet tall. So they estimate that it was 98 feet tall It's kind of hard to figure that out because the top of it doesn't exist. So they're not sure if it may have been taller than that or not, but that's what they estimate, close to 100 feet. 210 feet is the length on one side, going basically this way. And then you can see in the the width side is about 148 feet also as well from this way. So that's kind of, you can see it's kind of got this rectangular shape to it, which the Pyramid of Zoser was built like that too. It's built in kind of a rectangular shape as well, which was built, they think, around 2600 BC. So it's quite possible that that pyramid could have influenced the Sumerians to build something similar to that, of course, later. They think that this man named, I'll kind of go back up here if you don't mind, but there was a man named Leonard Woolley. I think his full name is Charles Leonard Woolley. He's a very famous archaeologist of that period, early 20th century. He actually rediscovered the site of Ur in the 1920s, right after World War I. He came there because he was kind of trying to find proof that various biblical places existed, I guess like Shinar and Ur and all that. And so he went there and he discovered what was the site of the ancient city of Ur, which is not that far from, like I said, Nazareth, which is in the southeastern part of Iraq today. And so he started some of the early excavations of it there, which included the ziggurat. It included, they think, like they found like a bunch of like cemeteries there where they buried their dead, the Sumerians. And they also found what they think was part of later the house of Abraham that may have existed there at one point. Whether that's true or not, they're not sure. Here's, of course, another image, of course, of the great ziggurat of Ur. They do think that later the ziggurat was kind of added to over time. Like a lot of the outside of the facade of it now, including the staircase of it, was later added by President Hussein, Saddam Hussein, excuse me, of Iraq, who was president of Iraq, who, by the way, spent a lot of money on ancient antiquities of Mesopotamia or Iraq today. He spent something like over $500 million trying to restore a lot of the antiquities of Ur. He rebuilt parts of ancient Babylon, such as Nebuchadnezzar's palace. That's there today. I think he may have also, they think, reconstructed what is the house of Abraham, which you can see there. That's maybe, I guess, what it could have looked like a long time ago. That's really what it is. Maybe they think he was from there, but well, that's his house there that was there. Maybe it was. They're not sure about that, but that's just some of the things that's kind of famous, about Iraq, all these different, antiquities that they've tried to kind of, preserve at one point. But if you know about Iraq, they've had a lot of problems with people stealing antiquities, especially after all the wars. There's kind of a black market for it, as you know, in that part of the Middle East. Same thing in Egypt. They have problems with that kind of going on, where people try to steal stuff or rob antiquities and things like that. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about too, as well, is I need to talk about the religion. And I'll get to it later. I probably won't talk about it now, but we'll kind of wait till I get to King Nebuchadnezzar. But he did build the famous, Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which I think that's a better image behind me that you can see, which was built in the 6th century BC. But they think that may have been some kind of ziggurat that was constructed, but it was built more like a palace and garden, like a garden area that was constructed for like one of his wives, which I'll kind of mention later about, not right now, but we'll talk about that when I get to the Babylonians, of course, later. But let me talk about religion of the Sumerians. The Sumerians had different gods that they worshipped. I do have a I think, kind of a list of gods that they did have that were well known. These are kind of like some of the gods that they had in that list that were kind of famous, but I'll kind of go through the ones that were kind of well known because different cities had different gods that they worshiped. There's kind of a list of them, but the city of Ur, I just mentioned a little while ago, its main god was the moon god Sin, which I told you was also called, actually it's called Nana, I think is actually how they say it, not Nanar, Nana, I think is how they say it actually. But that's usually, Sin is usually one of their gods that they worship. Eridu had the god Enki, which was a famous god of the earth, which was mostly god of the water, by the way. Iraq, you see there, which it's pronounced different ways, but Iraq is the common name. Its main god was the god Anu, which the Akkadians sometimes call An, A-N, or An, I guess we'll say it that way. And Anu was the supreme god of the Sumerians. It's the one that was the most worshipped god overall. Maybe the god where they get some of these other gods later that you have later, like the Greeks and Romans kind of see Anu as the equivalent to Zeus and Jupiter later. So it's kind of like similar to that. It's kind of like the sky god that kind of rules from the heavens, basically. Anu had two sons that were very famous. One named Enlil, I haven't talked about, which was mostly an air god or wind god. He was also associated with things like storms. And he was a god that was worshipped at the city-state of Nippur. Enki, I told you, was the other son of an Anu, who was, like I told you, mostly a water god at Eridu. So those gods like Anu, Enlil, Enki, were almost like a trinity or triad of Sumerian gods that were considered powerful and worshipped a lot by a lot of people. I didn't mention Utu, or they also later call him Shamash, I think by Babylonian times. But Shamash is a very famous god. It's, of course, a sun god that went back to Sumerian times. But it's also seen as this god of like law and justice, which appears a lot throughout history, up I think all the way down to the time of, I want to say, I guess Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar as kings. And it was seen as one of the chief gods that gave people in Mesopotamia law codes, like Hammurabi code, because if you ever see the top of the Hammurabi code, like the steel, it's got a picture of Shamash on it, that particular god. But evidently that god was worshipped by two city-states, Larsa and also Sippur. There was some also as well, which I guess I'll mention too. There was this other god that was pretty important as well at Babylon that's you may have heard of, named Marduk, how they pronounced it. And Marduk was a very famous Babylonian god, which was associated with water and magic. It's believed to have been the main god that the Babylonians worshipped in Timonanki, like the massive ziggurat that I told you that may have been over 200 feet tall. And there's stories in the Bible where they tell about the fact that the statue of Marduk was like 20 feet tall, and it was made of solid gold. I forget the weight of it, but it was, I forget how heavy it was, but it was kind of considered very famous in antiquity and may have existed at one point. I think later it was stolen or something, they say, by invaders and probably melted down. Just kind of interesting. They had goddesses. I usually don't talk as much about goddesses, but here's some examples of different goddesses they did have. Like Nammu was a very famous goddess of the sea, and she was like the mother of Anu. Inanna, which later on the Assyrians called her Ishtar. She's pretty famous by Assyrian Babylonian times. Like, but I think Ishtar is worshipped down to the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. They've heard the Ishtar Gate that was famous at Babylon. It's like a fertility goddess. It's very famous. And then the Sumerians had this god named goddess named Ninkasi, which was associated with like alcohol. So they had like beer goddesses and things like that. And I guess Ninkasi's kind of similar to like a version of like the god Isis, goddess Isis, or Hathor in Egypt, which is a goddess associated with fertility and also things like alcohol as well. The Sumerians did have an afterlife. They actually believed that the so-called Sumerian underworld existed somewhere to the east in what is Iran, I think close to where the Zagros Mountains is. And they called it Kur, K-U-R. And it's kind of similar to like in the Bible. I think if you study in the Old Testament, the actual Hebrew name for the underworld or I guess heaven or afterlife or whatever is Sheol. You've heard that word Sheol being used. And then the Greeks had their name that they used, which is Hades, which Hades is the Greek name of Sheol, supposedly. So, but yeah, the Sumerian culture, they were dominant for the longest period, probably going back over 1,000 years, at one point. But they had other cultures that came in that were more dominant. I did want to talk about today before I go, which is well known, which had this culture you may have heard of, which was the Akkadian Empire that existed at one point. The Akkadian Empire was a type of Semitic state that they think formed in the 24th century. And this empire was later called different names. I think commonly they call it the Bible Akkad or a god. That's what they called it, because it started out as a city or city-state in the central part of Iraq. And then over time it expanded to conquer most of the region of Mesopotamia and part of Syria, and I think part of Turkey at one point. And here's the name originally from where they got it from. Akkad or Agad. I think Agad is actually the Hebrew name. I think that's mentioned in the Bible. They think that Akkad was located, I forget how many miles. It might be like 30, 40, or 50 miles south of Baghdad at one point, but they don't know where it is because the ruins of it don't exist anymore at one point. They think it was somewhere south of that, but they think it was like right above where Sumer was. And what happened over time, they think the Akkadians conquered Sumer, absorbed them into their own state, and formed an empire out of it. And there was a king named Sargon the Great, or king, or they also call him Sargon of Akkad. He actually formed the actual empire in the late 24th century. So he lived sometime in the 2300s of BC, King Sargon. And it's basically a multi-ethnic empire. It's not one people. In fact, it's considered one of the first multi-ethnic empires to form in the world. Most empires are multi-ethnic, made up of multiple peoples or races, etc. And so his empire would reign over Sumer, southern Iraq, later called Babylonia. They ruled over northern Iraq. They ruled over Syria. They ruled parts of Turkey, and maybe partially where probably Lebanon was at one point. And he had a dynasty, by the way. The empire, I believe it lasted, I want to say 150 years, from the 24th to about the 22nd century BC. And it was called the Sargonic Empire, Sargonic dynasty, which was made up of like 4 other rulers. It had 5 kings in it. 2 sons, I think, ruled, and he had some grandsons that also ruled as well. But it wasn't around very long. The empire itself was known for its mass conscription of armies, which they conscripted a lot of the males into the armies. And they were one of the first states to use the so-called composite bow, which is a new type of bow and arrow that became popular. It's a type of laminated bow that was made from like animal horn, wood, and animal sinew. And it was a lot more powerful bow compared to previous bows. I guess that was probably developed back in ancient times. And so they did have like some of the first professional armies that were able to conquer vast amounts of territory, which you'll see later they have. But predominantly it was a Bronze Age empire that existed at one point. But the empire itself folded later. It was later conquered by these peoples called the Gutian peoples, which were some kind of nomadic peoples that lived in the western part of Iran, where the Zagros Mountains were. They came in and sacked Iraq, and the empire collapsed and fell apart after that. I think they ruled for a while, and then what happened was, I don't know if you go into it, but in the 22nd to the 21st century, there was actually a Neo-Sumerian period that came in. The Sumerians had their last hurrah, where they had this third dynasty that ruled from the city of Ur, and it was kind of like a Neo-Sumerian type empire that slowly reigned. Some people call it Ur-3 for short, because it was the third dynasty of the kings of Ur. So really, Ur was one of the most powerful city-states of Sumerians down to that time period. But by that time period, they're more of a mix of peoples that are kind of like Akkadian Sumerian is what they are, because the Akkadians absorbed a lot of the Sumerian culture into their state, etc. Now, I'll be getting into it later, but I'll be talking about kind of what happens to Mesopotamia. I'll kind of get to it later, but you're going to have this other empire that's kind of formed later, which is the so-called Babylonian Empire that you have. Some people call it Paleo, or the old Babylonian Empire, later founded by King Hammurabi and all that. But what happens later is that Mesopotamia splits into two separate spheres. If you know about this, the southern part of Iraq, they start calling it Babylonia because of the Babylonians and obviously the capital of Babylon, which is very famous. Of course, you have that forms first. And then the northern part of Iraq in Syria is an area called Assyria, or Assyria, I think is how they actually say it. And so you get this Assyrian Empire that you have that forms in the north, of course. So you got these two separate states, Babylonian empires and Assyrian empires, that kind of form at one point. And I'll get to it next week. We'll talk about how these Semitic people come in, called the Amorites, which I think originated close to the eastern part of Syria. They take over Babylonia. They form this Babylonian Empire, which kind of starts around the 18th century BC. And we'll talk about King Hammurabi. He's this famous king, that is famous for the famous law codes, the Hammurabi Code you've heard of, which I guess kind of influenced the Bible later in the Old Testament. So we'll talk about that. I'll also talk about the Hittites. Hittites sacked Babylon, of course, later as well. We'll talk about them. I'll kind of talk about later on the Assyrian Empire. Then I'll talk about the Chaldean Empire of King Nebuchadnezzar, so-called Neo-Babylonian Empire, also is what some people call it. So I'll get to that later. And so we'll get into like part 2 later, the later part of Mesopotamia on Monday, like next week. So before I leave today, I did want to remind you about, some of the different assignments that you'll have out there right now. I think right now, as I've said, you'll have the contract policy page, of course, still turn in. If you haven't done that yet, pre-test closed, as you know. And of course, the main thing, you need to get done for next week is the pre-history quiz, which I think is due sometime next week around Wednesday. So I'll keep sending out reminders, of course, about that, about trying to wrap that up. And so that's it for today. It doesn't look like there's any body else on there. I didn't say hi to Jennifer. I'm sorry. I just kind of didn't see that late. But it doesn't look like there's any questions or comments right now that I need to share with you. But that's it for today. Of course, over the weekend, I will send out announcements about upcoming lectures coming up. But if you have a comment, or question, of course, about about this, lecture or any previous lecture, please let me know on my YouTube channel. You can send me any kind of comments, questions. If you got an administrative question, you can, of course, email me. I think you pretty much got my email address out there. And that's it, of course, for the day. So y'all take care and have a great weekend.